we're looking at the internal structure of Nazi Germany, and I left off. We were exploring, especially today, the Nazi police state, and certainly a police state really is defined by what the Nazis did, and I guess to a certain extent, totalitarianism in Soviet Russia as well. But today we're going to look a little bit further into the establishment, as I say, of the police administration, the security services, as well as the concentration camp system. I was looking at last week, before we left off, I was looking at Himmler, Heinrich Himmler's biography a little bit, and I've been giving you bits and pieces of it as we've been coming along since that first introductory lecture. Himmler essentially is a cigar smoking gangster in a uniform, in a police uniform. And here he is. And I described how Himmler is also building the SS as this kind of Teutonic order of knights, a kind of a modern order of Teutonic knights. It's essentially a cult, and I described kind of how they have their own religious rituals, their own marriage rites, their own kind of Nazi baptismal rites, and so forth. And Himmler, I had mentioned in the choice of black uniforms as a sign of racial purity for the SS, that Himmler is very much inspired by the Jesuits, not only by the black robes of the Jesuits, but as well the Jesuit educational system and Jesuit discipline. As the Jesuits like to say, give us a child, at the age of 5, and they will belong to the church forever. And indeed, that's kind of Himmler's approach. Give us your young at the beginning, and they will belong to the Nazi Party forever. And I'll read you later a quote from Hitler as well, exactly what that means. And so I've described some of the rituals. They also include, as I described, the handing out of these daggers, Holbein-style daggers with the inscription, "My loyalty is my honor," the honor swords that he would distribute to his minions. And again, one of the highest awards in the SS would have been a so-called honor ring. And again, if you look closely at photographs of prominent Nazis, you do see often they're wearing these kinds of rings that they wear right into battle. And this is what they look like. Each one is inscribed, usually with the name of the holder. Between 1934 and 1944, a 10-year period, 14,500 of these rings were given to high-ranking or SS men who distinguished themselves in some way. These rings were intended to be returned upon the owner's death. The families were not allowed to keep them. Once their owner was dead, they were supposed to be returned, and so we do actually have some statistics on that. Just to give you some sense of the death rate among SS honor ring holders, 64% were returned. upon the death of the owner, either in combat or by natural causes. Another 10% are lost on the battlefield, never recovered. And the remaining 26% remained in the possession of the holder or unaccounted for completely. And so this 64% of the rings, Himmler had them sealed in a cave and then dynamited the cave shut. So somewhere there's several thousand, around, I guess, 10,000 or 8,000 of these rings. Each one today sells around $5,000 on the collector's market if you ever got a hold of a genuine one. So you can imagine treasure hunters somewhere in the south of Germany near Wewelsburg searching for that cave. There's a fortune waiting for someone in these rings if they ever find them. So right after that the blood banner that I described, the honor ring cave is the next kind of treasure that everybody is looking from missing Nazi loot. There's Wewelsburg, and again, I introduced you to Wewelsburg in a very first lecture where it was described as Himmler's Camelot. This is where he gathered his Teutonic Knights of the Round Table, where they held their rituals and so forth, and we don't know very much. Here's an example of a photograph of a kind of a gathering in the crypt of Wewelsburg Castle. This is what it looks like today. We don't know quite what was out there on these kind of little pedestals here, what statues stood there, nor are we sure what was set in the middle. It's unclear. And up in the roof of the vault, you can see, of course, the kind of brickwork swastika there. SS men are all in officer school, trained and educated in runic symbology, which is very important to Nazi Germany. It's a kind of a form of occult magic where you can combine these various runes. Each one means something, but you can combine them into a spell. I've already described how, for example, that Sieg rune, the lightning rune, which stands for victory, Sieg, victory, is of course incorporated in the uniform of the SS, because by coincidence, SS, double lightnings, some very smart graphic designer came up with that. As I say, you could see these combinations on the battlefield. For example, these combination of runes that are put together, and there's, I don't know much about runic magic, nor am I particularly interested in magic, but there is this kind of elemental system to it, where these runes again are combined into spells. Each rune means something. There you can see the Sieg rune. For example, G, the Opfer rune, stands for self-sacrifice. H is known as the Eif rune, which stands for zeal. The Tier rune, K, is also known as the Kampf rune, or the warrior rune. We'll see the warrior rune used in SS graves. There's, each one has a meaning. E For example, the Wolf's Angle. It's a rune that was used by German peasants during the revolts in the medieval era. It's also known as a rune that fights werewolves. Um, the Odal rune at the bottom, of course, represents ancestry, kinship. It's one that's often used in neo-Nazi symbology today. J is the death rune, and I, the Leben rune, the life rune. So birth and death. Um, you can figure it out. So how these runes get used again, as I say, often in symbols. They're often divisions, not just the SS, but German military divisions as well adopt runes as divisional signage on their vehicles, as insignia and decals. Here you can see what an SS-man's grave looks like. SS soldiers were not buried under a Christian cross; they were buried under a pagan rune, and so here you can see the actual kind of slope is the tier the warrior rune, right? The tier rune or the Kampf rune, and then you can see the life is celebrated, the life of the warrior with the other two arms of that. And then if you look closely at the inscription, again, you can see rather than putting date of birth and the date of death, there's just a life rune there and then a death rune. So there you can see regular army soldiers were buried under a cross, kind of an iron cross, but nonetheless a cross. SS then, as I say, were discouraged from Christianity, and of course their grave markers there. Again, you can see a death rune as a base, and then this plate. Yeah, you can see the Sieg runes on this in Lieutenant Colonel's collar. These runes were so incorporated in Germany that, especially the double Sieg for the SS, that they even were incorporated into the typewriter keyboards. Rather than typing SS, the Nazis had a specific key and font that had that double lightning. There you can see it just above the number 5. So a typed Nazi document produced by the SS would, there you can see the SS is just a single font like that. That, in a way, for you, if you're using websites, is sometimes a hint, a quick hint, just, if you want to get a sense of neo-Nazi websites, often you see kind of admirers of the SS or neo-Nazis, rather than using in their website, a double S. What they do is they put a little JPEG image where the double S is with the two Sieg runes to kind of make their website look like an authentic Nazi document. So, if you hit a website with those SS runes in the actual text, that's a hint that there's some nutter there behind the website. So, when we talk about the police state, we're, of course, often we think of the Gestapo, the Geheime Staatspolizei, the secret state police. I've already as well, described for you what actually secret means. It's, why secret? They have offices. They're listed in the phone book. They wear uniforms. What's so secret? And of course, it doesn't mean secret in the way we use that term. It means privy, as in, British parliamentary or Canadian parliamentary system, where you have a privy council that's above the politicians, sort of immune to political interference or electoral change, and so forth. The Geheime Staatspolizei has the power to investigate anybody, and so. I don't know if they had the power to investigate Hitler. I'm sure it wasn't tested, but I guess not having tested it, nonetheless, I guess theoretically they would have had the power to even investigate the Fuhrer if they had reason to, although certainly it never was tested. Heinrich Himmler, as I say, becomes eventually the head of the Gestapo. Reinhard Heydrich will run it for a short period prior to Mueller. Mueller, again, is a former Berlin police officer, not really a Nazi. In fact, he was notorious for arresting Nazis. And to this day, we don't know what happened to Heinrich Mueller. He vanishes in 1945 successfully. They don't even find a skull for him the way they found for Martin Bormann. So there are I think these are conspiracy myths that Heinrich Mueller was either a Russian Secret Service operative who rose up in the ranks of the Gestapo, but was always a Russian spying for the Russians, and of course that is not an implausible theory, as Russian intelligence in the 1930s, of course, had infiltrated. We certainly saw in England with the Cambridge Five, they infiltrated the highest ranks of the British security establishment in MI5 and MI6. Some very senior officers were Russian spies since their college days. They were recruited at Cambridge University. So that, with all that chaos and the power and the strength of the German Communist Party in the 1930s, it's entirely plausible that Russian agents entered into the various ranks of the Nazi bureaucracy, as they did in the American and the British ones and in the Canadian ones throughout the 30s. So it's not implausible. We just don't have any evidence for it. The Gestapo, of course, is not the only police agency. Probably the second most notorious and most powerful security agency will be the SD, the Sicherheitsdienst, or the Security Service. This begins as a Nazi Party intelligence agency. It's essentially founded to spy on dissident Nazis, to spy on the socialist wing of the Nazi Party. It's as I say, a Nazi Party internal agency. Before the Nazis came to power, it's founded when the Nazis are just struggling within their own organization, and the SD, of course, once the Nazis come to power, and you have the unity of the party and state implemented by December of 1933, the SD then is going to become a national security agency. There's again the problem with the German language. For some reason, they take a number of words and they slam them together into one word. In other languages, it would have been two words: Sicherheits, which means security, and Dienst, which means service. You can recognize SD officers in photographs because of that diamond that they wear on their sleeve. They wear police uniforms or SS uniforms. You notice again, there's just a black empty space on their right collar where the double lightning rune goes, and their rank, just like in the SS, is shown on the other collar. And again, the eagle is sewn to their sleeve. And of course, the SD in its uniform state are going to be essentially the administrators of occupied Europe. Every major city in Europe will have an SD commander who essentially is responsible for security in an occupied territory, and they will also be responsible in rounding up people for labor, for slave labor, rounding up Jews for the death camps, and fighting resistance, and so forth. Here you can see an SD security unit in Poland. Their founder, Reinhard Heydrich, he might be described as perhaps one of the most evil men of the 20th century, certainly among the top 10. He looks the part. If I was casting a movie and I needed, a Nazi, I would look for someone who looks like him. He just gives off this aura of evil. Extraordinarily cruel, no doubt a sociopath. This is his full name, Reinhard Tristan Jürgen Heydrich. He's the son of Bruno Heydrich, who is a kind of B-list composer in Germany. He himself, Reinhard, is a talented musician when he's a young man, a cellist. And he will continue to play the cello in private quartets. He doesn't become a professional musician. Heydrich is a naval officer, young naval officer during the First World War. Or shortly after the First World War. I mean, he's born in 1904, so I don't think he served. Maybe he was a cadet during the First World War. But in the Weimar area, he serves in what's left of the German Navy, and he's a bit of a ladies' man, and Heydrich ends up breaking off an engagement with an admiral's daughter, and that gets him into trouble. He is charged with dishonorable conduct, and he's cashiered from the Navy in either the late 1920s or early 1930s, shortly before Hitler comes to power. And the circumstances of the story are a little bit unclear because terminating an engagement with an admiral's daughter is not technically a cashierable offense. There are, again, conspiracy theories that Heydrich perhaps entered the Nazi Party to spy on the Nazis for naval intelligence. Interestingly enough, Heydrich is a officer on Admiral Canaris's flagship, and of course Admiral Canaris will be the head of German military intelligence, the Abwehr, and in fact Heydrich and Canaris have a relationship long before Heydrich himself joins the Nazi Party, is thrown out of the Navy and becomes part of the kind of security administration. So was Heydrich sent out by the German Navy to spy on the Nazis? Maybe. But perhaps, like Hitler, once he got in there, he may have gone, in his own direction. Here's Admiral Canaris. And of course, as I say, Canaris and Heydrich will have this long relationship. They'll become rivals, in fact. Heydrich wants to take over the Abwehr, and Canaris, of course, by the 1940s is disillusioned with Nazi Germany. Canaris himself starts liaisoning with British intelligence in Paris. The file on Canaris is still classified in the British intelligence archives. Again, those files are not going to be opened up till 2044 at the earliest. We're not quite sure exactly the extent of Canaris's cooperation with the Allies during the war, but ostensibly, as I say, Canaris is the head of military intelligence. He'll become implicated in the July 20th plot. And Canaris, of course, will be arrested, and he will be held in a concentration camp. He's not executed immediately, but in April, as Nazi Germany is collapsing, Canaris is then hung in the concentration camp before the Allies could get to him. And of course, the moment after July 20th, Heydrich actually, although he's not around anymore, by then Heydrich is dead, Heydrich's wishes come true. The Abwehr gets taken over by the Nazi security apparatus as well. Heydrich, as he's kind of plotting against Canaris, he's playing again in a quartet with Canaris's wife, who also is a talented musician. On Friday nights, they get together and play in this quartet. In any regards, Heydrich's girlfriend is a member of the Nazi Party. She'll become his wife eventually as well. And she's the one who sets up an appointment for Heydrich with Heinrich Himmler, who's looking for an intelligence officer. And the way the story goes is that Himmler is impressed with Heydrich's blue eyes. He's kind of these cruel Aryan features. And he asks Heydrich to draw up a kind of operations plan. He gives them an hour for how Nazi Party's intelligence would work. Heydrich does this, and Himmler, in the mistaken belief that Heydrich was an intelligence officer in the Navy. He wasn't. He was a signals officer. But for some reason, Himmler mistook that. He thought he was an intelligence, signals intelligence officer. And so he reads Heydrich's proposal. He likes it, and Heydrich is hired. And Heydrich becomes the first chief of the SD. And as the years go by, Heydrich's responsibility will start expanding. Eventually, as I say, he's appointed, after Rudolf Diehl, he's appointed as the head of the Gestapo, before handing that over to Mueller, and then he'll keep rising, and eventually he's going to oversee this massive organization that I'll take some time to look at in a few minutes, known as the RSHA. But he is described as kind of cold, pathological, cruel, evil. His nickname, one of his nicknames, is the Goat, because he has this kind of goat-like bleating laugh. Hitler, in 1941, will appoint him as the governor of Czechoslovakia, with orders to pacify Czechoslovakia. In 1941, there's a sharp increase of resistance among Czechs, and Heydrich begins to kind of systematically hang thousands of Czechs, hostages, families of resistance fighters, and so forth. That will earn him the nickname, the hangman of Prague. He serves in he wants to have combat experience. So in 1941, while he's the head of this vast security operation and as well the architect of what's going to become the final solution, Heydrich flies over 100 aerial missions over Russia. He's actually shot down by the Russians at one point over Russian lines and has to escape. And after being shot down, he is personally ordered by Hitler to cease flying combat missions because Hitler and Himmler both begin to fear that Heydrich, might get captured by the Russians. So again, typical of that polycratic, authoritarian, chaotic state. Heydrich is not only the head of the German intelligence community, not only the architect of what will become known as the Holocaust or the final solution, not only a Luftwaffe pilot, but also a governor of occupied Czechoslovakia, and probably a whole bunch of other offices that he held. Here you can see he's in the presidential palace in Prague. Heydrich is very rarely photographed below the waist. They kind of often crop his photographs that way, or if photographs appear of him below the waist, he'll be wearing these kind of cavalry breeches, and there's a reason for that. Heydrich has another nickname other than the goat. Some of his officers behind his back, mind you, snicker. They call him Lady Hips. Heydrich apparently has these kinds of very kind of feminine hips that everybody laughs about. They say that Heydrich should be bearing children, not his wife. Here again, you can see kind of the hippie look that Heydrich has. I mean, he's got more curves than his wife standing next to him there, Lena. The other kind of ego issue for Heydrich, he's also very rarely photographed or photographs published of him in profile. Partly, you can look at that schnoz he has on his face. It looks exactly like the kinds of Semitic noses that German children are taught in Nazi Germany. You recognize a Jew by the shape of his nose. Well, Heydrich does indeed have this kind of Middle Eastern, Arabic, Semitic, Jewish, if you want to say, Sephardic nose. And here we can see Time magazine when he appears on the cover of Time. The American press actually straightened his nose a little bit. You can see it's here. It's just classical Semitic nose, and here the artists at Time magazine kind of give him a little bump, almost Aryanizing Heydrich's profile. So there are all these rumors that Heydrich actually has Jewish blood in his past, and that maybe Himmler knows that somewhere in Himmler's safe might be a birth registration for one of Heydrich's relatives, and the theory, the argument is that Heydrich might be a self-loathing Jew, in fact, and of course that's used in, again, disinformation and in propaganda. Again, there's no evidence for it. Somewhere in the 1920s, a rival of his father wrote a encyclopedia of German music, and claimed that Bruno Heydrich, the father, had Jewish ancestry. But again, there's no evidence to that. But indeed, Himmler by 1941 fears Heydrich, because Heydrich has become so powerful, has his own administration, his own apparatus, that even Himmler begins to fear him. And moreover, Hitler loves Heydrich. Hitler practically adopts Heydrich as the son he never had. He's like the perfect Nazi child. You know, he's young, as I say, born 1904. He's cruel. He's hard as Krupp steel. He's fast. He's a champion fencer. He's a heroic pilot. He's athletic. Everything that Hitler wants out of the Nazi super race. So Heydrich, as you can see, is going to be quite close to Hitler in the hierarchy. Heydrich essentially is a desk killer. It's unclear whether Heydrich ever, other than when he was a pilot, ever took a life. He put a lot of people to death. You can see all those rubber stamps on his desk there. It's these rubber stamps with which he essentially is going to kill and supervise the death of literally millions of people, not only Jews, but Poles, Slavs, Serbs, French, Romanians, anybody who ends up under the eyes of the SD and the security establishment. Heydrich is going to head one of the SS's. Remember, I kind of showed you the empire of the SS. There were these 10 or 12 major head departments known as Hauptamts. Haupt means main or head. Amt means department, and this is a particular bureaucratic lexicon that the Nazis use. The Nazis developed their own unique bureaucratic language, thousands of terms that are going to be unique to Nazi Germany, and Hauptamt, Amt is one of them. I don't think Germany uses that terminology today. I'm not sure. You can fact check me on that, but as far as I know, they don't. And so a Hauptamt is a head department that's divided into Amter, the plural for Amt, sub-departments. And so Heydrich is going to end up heading up the Reichssicherheitshauptamt, the Reichssecurity main office. This is what it looks like, the organizational chart. I put a link on my website to this chart if you want to study it closer, but I'll break it down for you a little bit. First of all, you can see how every Hauptamt is divided into Amters that are designated by a Latin number, a Roman numeral. So Amt 1, Amt 2, and then you have a subdivision, which is then designated by an alphabetical letter. So personnel, education, training, and indoctrination is Department 1B. If you look down to Amt 2, you can see each one of those departments would then be further subdivided into smaller departments designated by an Arabic numeral. So organization and law, Amt 2A2 looks at legislation, or Amt 2A3 indemnification, Amt 2A5 confiscations, citizenship, and so forth. So UMP1, UMP2 are kind of these administrative departments, personnel, physical training, disciplinary affairs, budgetary matters, control of passports, technical things. So those are the first two UMPs of the Hauptamt. Then you have Heinrich's old organization, which Heinrich, of course, has now only nominally commands. There is a separate commander now of the SD. This is known as the SD Inland. Just like it sounds, it means it's internal. SD, the Internal Security Service. It has approximately 3,000 staff members. And as I say, I guess the closest we can draw parallel to it, at least in Canada, would be with CSIS. It's the Internal Security Intelligence Agency. It collects all sorts of information. It doesn't really have policing functions. That's the Gestapo. In the same way as CSIS and the RCMP have to work together. CSIS in Canada cannot arrest anyone. CSIS can collect the information, and then they have to give it to the RCMP, which will seek an indictment and will issue charges. So the SD, the internal SD, inside of Germany functioned that way. Outside of Germany, they operated in a different way. There, they worked together with the Gestapo and the Kripo. And again, I'll look at that. What you'll see, and I'll give you, check your announcements later today. I'll give you a couple of readings, and one of them kind of looks at the operations of the Gestapo inside of Germany, and you realize how different it operates in Germany and then outside of Germany and occupied territories. So the SD, as I say, collects all sorts of information, including they produce public opinion reports for senior members of the Nazi Party. SD agents listen to conversations on the bus. They read graffiti. They catalog anti-Hitler or pro-Hitler leaflets. They collect all that, and every week they produce a public opinion report, a confidential public opinion report for high-ranking Nazi members, and those reports survived. And so when we today say, 30% of Germans did not approve of something or this and that, the evidence that we have for these opinion reports partly comes from these SD reports that survived after the war. Now, you have to take them with a grain of salt, as you do any intelligence report, if you use it as primary sources, because, of course, intelligence agencies tend to give the kind of information their client wants to hear. That's, a kind of built-in systemic defect of intelligence agencies, because an intelligence agency that gives its client information that displeases them risks losing funding, risks not having the ear of their client, whether it's a president, a prime minister, or a Fuhrer, as in the case of Germany, case of Nazi Germany. So you need to take those reports, like I say, with a grain of salt, but mostly they are a sincere effort to inform the Nazis of exactly how their policies, whether it's rationing or anti-Semitic policies, or taxation and so forth, how people are reacting to these policies long before any kind of protests can arise, and just guide the Nazi leadership in how to keep Germans happy. So that's one of their functions. You can see there's a whole department on national culture and art, 3C3, advanced knowledge, ethnicity, Germanization, immigration and resettlement. You can see Department 3D1. They gather intelligence and statistics on food production and distribution. 3D3 looks at financial banking industries. 3D5 looks at labor and social welfare. So you have, like I say, 3,000 staff officers and thousands of informants as well, but approximately 3,000 uniformed officers, mostly operating from desks. These the highly educated college graduates, each with a specialty, who are analyzing all this data that the SD is collecting. So that's the SD inland. Then you can see on the right, you have Amt 6, which is the Sicherheitsdienst Ausland. This is the Nazi Party's foreign intelligence service. And there you can see they're just organized in a rational way, based on geographic territories. And so I didn't break out all the departments, but you can see there's the German Italian sphere, the Eastern sector, the Russian Japanese sphere, the Western Anglo American, and then ideological technical services. Again, 400 staff officers and multiple, again, field operatives and agents. And they're operating essentially in the same way as the Abwehr is sending out operatives. For example, the Abwehr will send out saboteurs to land in submarines in the United States, for example. The SD also operates, although I don't think they landed anybody in the United States, or nobody that was caught. I mean, the history of espionage essentially is the history of intelligence failures. That's how we find out about what intelligence agencies are doing, is when there's a spectacular failure or a leak. So if it's never discovered, then we historians never know it happened. So as far as I know, SD never landed. SD Ausland never landed foreign agents into the United States, but I imagine they did. We just don't know about it. But we know they operated certainly in Europe. So that's SD Ausland. It's headed by, again, a young lawyer by the name of Walter Schellenberg. So that's SD Ausland. You have Amt 5, a very large department, the Kripo, the Kriminalpolizei, which is like equivalent to the FBI or the RCMP. It's the German criminal police. And again, they're going to fall under the command of Reinhard Heydrich. And again, here you can see their departments are kind of organized in a rational way, sex crimes, capital crimes, fraud. They have, Department 5D1, CSI, Department 5D2, forensic biochemistry, and so forth. So they're ostensibly the criminal police, but of course the criminal police will be used along with the Gestapo to prosecute not only criminal offenses but political and military offenses as well, especially again outside of Germany. You'll see when you read that article I give you on the Gestapo how policing, it depends on very much. German citizens get a very different quality of policing than foreigners do, or occupied territories. And that applies to the Kripo. So roughly 20,000, again, uniformed or plainclothes police officers, the Kriminalpolizei. Here you have Amt 7, And this is the research and evaluation department. Again, they have their own library. You can see Department of 7B. 7B1 specializes in collecting research information on Freemasonry and Jews. There is no relationship between Freemasonry and Jews, but certainly in Nazi minds, they kind of have this vision of this Judeo-Bolshevik Masonic conspiracy. And of course, Bolshevism, the Freemasonry, and Judaism are three separate worlds, three separate universes altogether. But they combine Freemasonry and Jews in this one department. Again, you can see that here it's a less rational kind of organization. It's an ideological bureaucracy, unlike, say, the Kripo or the SD Ausland. You have Department 7C is archives. There's Department 7C2, the museum that I described to you also in the first lecture, where they were collecting all those heads and body parts. Special research, God only knows what went on in the special research department of 7C3 and so forth. Any questions so far? All right. The big one, the one that, of course, we're all familiar with that term, Gestapo, is Amt 4, the Gestapo, the Geheimstaatspolizei. It has between 40 and 46,000 staff and hundreds of thousands of so-called V-men with a V, like in victory, Vic. V-men are trusted agents, or what we would describe in police vocabulary today as CIs, confidential informants. And the Gestapo, essentially functions on denunciations coming from fellow Germans of other Germans, primarily. The Gestapo very rarely goes out into the streets of Germany again. When you talk about, Poland, France, occupied territories, they operate in a different way. But inside of Germany, and today we're primarily looking inside of Germany, the Gestapo essentially depends on denunciations coming in from other Germans. And in fact, so many Germans denounce their neighbor, their rival in business, that the Gestapo just doesn't have time to be out in the streets. They're spending most of their time opening anonymous letters and following up on various denunciations. That article that I assigned you about housewives, or sorry, not necessarily housewives, but wives denouncing their husbands to the Gestapo, just shows you how ideological and carefully the Gestapo investigates a accusation leveled against a German, as opposed to an accusation leveled against, for example, a Pole, perhaps, either living in Germany or under German occupation. The Gestapo is not what we often think it is, and I'll say no more until you've kind of read the article. Gestapo, of course, is key in the Holocaust. It's not even a subsection it's a subsection of the Gestapo that will essentially implement what will become known as the final solution. It's buried in Department 4B, sects, and the actual sub-department is called 4B4, evacuation and Jews. And every sub-department is headed by a lieutenant colonel, and in this case, it's going to be Adolf Eichmann. This is where Adolf Eichmann comes into play. He's the head of Department 4B4, and even though he's only a lieutenant colonel, he will have immense power, especially at the height of the whole Holocaust. He will actually be meeting, with heads of state. He'll be meeting with the head of state of France, of Hungary, of Bulgaria, Romania, demanding that they surrender their Jewish citizens to be murdered at Auschwitz, with various degrees of success. We'll see, for example, that the Bulgarians absolutely refuse to cooperate with the Nazis, even though the Bulgarians are allied with Nazi Germany. Bulgarian army is fighting on the Eastern Front alongside with German troops, but the Bulgarians refuse to hand over Bulgarian Jews to the Nazis. The Hungarians and the Romanians do. The Hungarians hold out to the very end of the war, and in fact, there will be a coup d'etat in Hungary, where a more right-wing government takes power in Hungary, and that seals the fate of the Jews. The French happily cooperate. The French are really helpful to the Nazis during the Holocaust, often doing much more than the Nazis even asked. All the Jews in Holland, for example, also are exterminated. The Dutch are kind of 50-50 on assisting them. Holland, the Dutch don't really have much choice because Holland is under a military occupation. Denmark, the Jews of Denmark survive under the Nazis. So what we'll see is that when the Holocaust happens, it happens in different countries, in different ways, in different intensities, depending upon the nature of the occupation or the relationship of that country to Nazi Germany. And so again, that suggests to us that there is something functional about the Holocaust rather than an intentional. There is no master plan if the Holocaust is happening in different countries in different ways. And nor are the Nazis prepared to, for example, we often imagine the Nazis just doing whatever they want, but they're not going to seize, for example, French Jews unless the French cooperate. And the French do. The French police help arresting Jews. The French militia, the milice, the Nazi militia, act as guards before they hand off the Jews to the SS for transport to the death camps. As I say, it happens in different countries in different ways. So again, suggesting there is no systemic plan. 4B4 originally is Eichmann's job is to, quote, help Jews get out of Germany. And the Nazis in the 1930s, what they are doing is they're actually encouraging Jews to leave. And as we'll see, the problem is not that Jews don't want to leave, is that other countries are not allowing them to come into their country. For a Jew to get an exit visa out of Nazi Germany in the 1930s is very easy, and Eichmann is there helping expedite the process. However, no country is giving entry visas to Jews. Anti-Semitism at that point is ubiquitous, and that includes Canada. So again, when we look at German racial policies, we'll look a little bit more on, and the final solution will look a little bit deeper into how Department 4B4 began as a kind of a genuinely an evacuation, or at least they could have called it an expulsion department, but let's give them evacuation department before it became, once the Nazis made the decision that now we're just going to kill the Jews, then Department 4B4 becomes the main department charged with the final solution, and Eichmann, of course, now becomes one of these pivotal figures in the final solution, responsible for millions and millions of Jewish deaths. So that's Department 4B4 and the Gestapo altogether. And again, you can see the Department 4E, the counterintelligence department, that would be kind of equivalent to the FBI today in the United States. As you know, in the US, the CIA cannot spy inside the United States. The FBI does that. And so Department 4E, you can see again, is kind of organized rationally by geographic territory. From Department 4E1 is treason, 4E2 is economic or industrial espionage, counter-espionage. Department 4D, again, is geographically organized, yet Department 4B is organized ideologically based on Nazi racial ideology, less rational. So, there's Mueller, head of the Gestapo, and here you can see the RSHA, the various policing heads meeting, and Himmler, of course, is nominally at the top. Heinrich is the head then of all the other departments, and then the rest of the guys sitting around the table, Mueller to the right, are reporting to Heinrich, essentially. These are the chiefs of the various police departments. Here you can see a old fighter. For example, Himmler has the old fighter's chevron. Here you can see an old fighter with a chevron and a pip in it. If you see that pip inside the chevron, it means that not only was this individual a member of the Nazi Party prior to Hitler becoming chancellor January 30th, 1933, but that he was a secret member of the Nazi Party because he was either in the military or the police. And so that's what that little dot, that pip inside the chevron, means on an old fighter's chevron. This department, the Reichssicherheitshauptamt, of course, is the police state. The Gestapo, we've all heard about. You've now heard about also the Kripo, the Kriminalpolizei. You also have, once the Gestapo and the Kriminalpolizei are deployed abroad, there they collectively become known as the ZIPO, the Sicherheitspolizei, the security police. Although there is no formal organization known as the ZIPO, they're just generically referred to. The Gestapo, Kriminalpolizei operating abroad are often referred to as the ZIPO, the security police. You also have the ORPO. This is the Ordnungspolizei, the order police. This is kind of like a country gendarmerie. The traffic police on the highways. They're going to be deployed as well to monitor the rear of the German army for safety in occupied territories, as well for the safety of military troops, traffic police. They're kind of almost like the criminal police, but more engaged in keeping order. All right, especially traffic, the Ordnungspolizei. And then you have the Schupo as well. And the Schupo are the Schutzpolizei. The Schutzpolizei are the village and town police, your local traffic parking cop, essentially. Your local village cop will be with the Schutzpolizei. So, if you want to talk about a police state, there's the alphabet soup of the Nazi police state right there for you. They have extraordinary powers, of course, undreamt of in democratic society. Their power is indicated often by this warrant disc that they carry on a chain. This one, as you can see, is for the Gestapo, the Geheim Staatspolizei. There, the officer's badge number is engraved onto this chain. There's the Reichssiegel on the other side. Just a flash of this disc gives a Gestapo officer in occupied territories unlimited power without a warrant to arrest, search premises, wiretap. They don't need to go before a judge. They can just come to your house, flash the disc, and you open your door. They don't need a search warrant, and they don't need an arrest warrant. And in occupied territory, these officers will also have the power to just walk you out into the backyard and shoot you in the head on the spot if they choose to do so. So they're judge, jury, and executioner at the same time. These discs are similar in the Kriminalpolizei, the state criminal police, and they're worn on a chain. Usually in the vest pocket, as Gestapo officers are often in civilian dress, so they'll wear this in their vest pocket. So massive organization. We're talking about 100,000 strong security intelligence community. If you're looking at U.S. intelligence during the Second World War, on the eve of Pearl Harbor, there were maybe less than 100 full-time military intelligence officers. Less than 100 military intelligence officers on the eve of Pearl Harbor. That's one of the things that, of course, Pearl Harbor, the intelligence failure at Pearl Harbor is often attributed to this kind of low-scale U.S. commitment to intelligence. The only other comparable organization to this might be the Russian secret services, which eventually we'll generically know them as the KGB. In the 30s and 40s, they're known as the GRU, then the NKVD. The Russians will have as sophisticated an intelligence service, but certainly none of the Western countries, not even MI5 or MI6 in Britain or the 12e Bureau in France, have as sophisticated and massive police and intelligence communities that the Nazis have. And again, you're looking at just the state security. The Navy has its own intelligence organization. The Abwehr has its own intelligence organization. The Air Force does, as does the German Foreign Office. They'll have their own intelligence organization collecting diplomatic intelligence and so forth. So, we're talking probably about, in Nazi Germany, at least 500,000 to 750,000 to maybe a million intelligence officers and operatives working for various Nazi and military agencies. So it's a vast intelligence state. The RSHA is only one department out of multiples of departments that are headed by Heinrich Himmler in running the SS. And I won't go through all of them, but I will look at those that are certainly significant to genocide, to policing, to the medical murders, and certainly to the military as well. Here you can see the Das Imperium, the empire of Nazi Germany, of the SS. I'll look at these three are significant. First of all, the SS Führungshauptamt, where the Allgemeine, the General SS, and the militarized arm, the Waffen SS are. The Waffen SS will have approximately, they'll be the largest branch eventually of the SS. They will have approximately 800,000 members, the militarized part of the SS, combat soldiers. Then you have the Wirtschafts- and Verwaltungsamt, the WVHA. This is the Economics and Administration Office, and that is the department where the slave labor and concentration camps will be run by. And then you have the RSHA, and the RSHA will run the death camps, the annihilation camps, the so-called Vernichtungslager, or the so-called Reinhardt camps, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec. Those are the only camps that are run by the RSHA. But camps like, for example, Auschwitz or Buchenwald or Dachau will be run by the WVHA, the Economics Administration Office. These camps are essentially, as I say, run in partnership with German corporations, to whom the WVHA is renting slaves. WVHA is headed by Oswald Pohl, Pohl. It's structured similarly as the RSHA is, with Department D being the concentration camps. You can see there's let's get a bigger picture. I won't go through the details of it, but you can see how it runs troop administration, troop economy, building projects. They do have construction projects and so forth, concentration camps, and economic enterprises. These are all various businesses run by the WVHA in parallel to German corporations. Here's Oswald Pohl. He's a former naval paymaster, an accountant, in other words. He's one of the knights of the Round Table. In fact, he has this portrait painted of himself as a Teutonic knight. This photograph I've always wanted an explanation for. It's Oswald Pohl, clearly, and he's wearing an SS fez. When I talk about the Foreign Legion of the SS, they had a couple of divisions of Islamic troops from Bosnia and from Albania that volunteered for the SS, and so he's wearing one of those fezes, and he is also wearing a what looks like a dress or a robe. So, and he's barefoot. So, I don't know what's going on in this photograph, but it's just one of the craziest photographs I've seen in German sources of Nazis. Dachau, of course, is the first concentration camp. It was originally, if I'm not mistaken, either a munitions factory or a barracks, and it's first taken over by the SA, and then the SS take over Dachau. It's located in the village of Dachau, which is a suburb of Munich in southern Germany. And if you look at Dachau, the camp, you can see this is where the barracks were there. That's the kind of camp administration there, and then all the barracks lined up in the row. And you can see just down from the concentration camp is the main drag of the village. With all just people's houses right along there. So, this thing about, oh, we didn't know what was happening, certainly people who lived around these houses could have just looked out their back window and they could see what's happening inside the camp. That's what it would have looked like on the ground. The SS guards are known as the SSTV, the SS Totenkampfverbände, the SS Death's Head units, as they become known, because, of course, because of the death skull they wear. The head of the concentration camp guards, and who's going to devise the kind of the discipline, is also a former paymaster. This one from the army, Theodor Eicke. He'll be assigned as the inspector. He's the guy in the center that kind of looks like Russell Crowe, the actor. He'll be known by his SS guards as Papa Eicke, because he kind of is this kind of harsh disciplinarian, but he always looks out for the welfare of the concentration camp guards. Eicke, as I say, is a former paymaster. He then joins the German police in 1919, but he is dismissed from the police for pro-Nazi activity. In 1932, he plants a bomb in Germany, and he apparently is either accidentally or deliberately informed upon by another senior Nazi party member, and he's sentenced in absentia, and so he escapes to Italy before they can actually put their hands on him in 1932. Once the Nazis take power, Eicke returns, and then he beats up that Nazi who had, he thinks informed on him, and that Nazi is a Gauleiter. And so no matter who you are, you don't beat up a Gauleiter. And so Eicke is arrested for assault on, one of the governors of Nazi Germany, and Himmler gets him an insanity plea, essentially, and so Eike is hospitalized in a psychiatric facility. It's said that he's kind of overwrought by his experience in exile. That's why he had, beaten up this Nazi. He's forgiven, and then Himmler plucks Theodor Eicke out of the insane asylum and puts him in charge of the SS guards. He becomes the inspector of the Nazi concentration camp system, June 1933. Eicke, of course, is also the guy who's going to come and visit Rome when he's in his prison cell and present Rome with a handgun with one bullet. And when Rome refuses to commit suicide, Eicke then, with his own sidearm, will shoot Rome inside the prison cell. Ruthless individual. Eicke will, here he is in war period. Eicke eventually will be transferred out of the concentration camp service and will become commander of former young SS concentration camp guards who get militarized in 1940, and concentration camp guards will then become more elderly men, where young concentration camp guards end up being put into the third SS Waffen SS division, and eventually that division starts recruiting, as the first generation get killed off in Russia, begin recruiting regular troops. But Eicke will become a military commander on the Eastern Front, and somewhere, I think in 1942, his airplane will be shot down by the Russians, and he'll be killed in Russia. But in the meantime, in the 30s, as I say, he is training the Guard Corps. The motto that he introduces is, quote, "Toleration is a sign of weakness. Any sign of pity for the enemies of the state," Eicke says, "is unworthy of an assessment." Eicke likes to remind everybody that SS concentration camp guards are the only soldiers in Germany facing the enemy on both sides of the barbed wire, as he likes to say, on the inside and the outside. Punishment for prisoners in these camps now becomes highly regulated. These camps were under the SA, when they were known as wild camps. There's no longer arbitrary punishment. Punishment has to be carefully registered in the book. It's standardized for minor offenses. For example, failing to take off your cap when an officer is passing by you, an SS guard. The punishment is 25 strokes with a cane. For more serious offenses, the strappado, as you can see illustrated in this photograph. This is an old Spanish torture used by the Inquisition, where your hands are tied behind your back and then you're lifted up, dislocating your shoulders. It's a very, very painful form of torture and punishment. The death penalty for more serious crimes like inciting disorder, mutinying, disobeying a guard's orders, assaulting a guard, sabotage. All those things are immediately given the death penalty. Again, guards cannot kill a prisoner arbitrarily the way they were able to do so under the SA during the wild camps. Here you can see a guard, here you can see an investigation taking place of the shooting of a prisoner who either was attempting to escape or walked perhaps to commit suicide into a forbidden zone, and he was shot out of the tower. And you can see in the picture, there's the guy with the bicycle with this kind of silver metallic breastplate, a gourd that he's wearing. That's a military policeman. German military police wear that thing. And he's probably a military policeman within the SS military police. So there's actually an investigation taking place right here. They're filling out a report on this particular shooting. So this idea that concentration camp guards could just come in and kill and torture anybody indiscriminately is partially a myth. Now, this is not the case for the death camps. So what I'm talking here is about first generation concentration camps in Germany, where the majority of inmates were German citizens. Whether they were Jews or not, communists, politicals, homosexuals, so-called asocials. We'll look at the various categories in a minute. But this is kind of a regulated, systematic governance. Punishment as well is highly regulated. The SS-man who assigns a punishment to a prisoner is not allowed to carry out the punishment. Another SS man must carry actually out the punishment. And this has a double function in Eicke's and Himmler's mentality. First of all, Himmler is very, very concerned that there are no sadists inside the concentration camps. He sees this as a kind of a sickness, sadism as a degeneracy. Himmler, and we'll talk again more about this, Himmler's motto is killing with decency. Himmler likes his guards to kill people and not like doing the killing. Himmler will say, I'd be very ashamed if any of you liked what you were doing. And so Himmler has this policy so that the guard, as I say, who assigns the punishment, some other guard has to do this so that sadistic guards don't get to assign punishments and then, whip the prisoner. But at the same time, guards that are reluctant to punish a prisoner can't get away from punishing a prisoner because they get assigned to punishing a prisoner that they didn't assign the punishment to. So it's a double-edged sword, ensuring that all the guards participate in the brutality. The guards as well, as I say, they're not allowed to talk to prisoners. They can't socialize or be friendly with prisoners, have any dealings with them, although obviously they do. The guards, for example, when prisoners are working in the rain, guards are not allowed to put raincoats or seek shelter. They're supposed to be as tough as the prisoner. They are supposed to take the same kind of weather conditions and cold of the inmates that they're escorting and so forth. Although obviously there's a lot of hypocrisy there, as they eat better, they sleep better, and so forth, but that's the principle. Here you can see a concentration camp officer, looks like a captain, and you can see that on their collar they wear a death's head right on the collar. They don't have the twin lightning Sieg runes. And that's how often you can recognize concentration camp guards, at least in the 1930s, because once the young concentration camp guards are militarized, their military unit will also wear the death's head. In fact, will be known as the 3rd SS Death's Head Division, Totenkommsdivision, and they also wear that death's head on their divisional uniform, but it's unclear whether these guys served in the concentration camp or were recorded afterwards. Some or were recruited afterwards. Some are ex-guards, some are not. Like this guy, for example, never served in the concentration camp, but he's an officer from that SS division. Here you can see concentration camp guards by the 1940s, and you can see they're old guys. They're either soldiers who were wounded in combat, like, for example, Dr. Mengele, who ends up at Auschwitz concentration camp after serving in a Waffen SS division in Russia. So they're often, as I say, wounded, or they're no longer of military age like these old guys. Anyway, here's Ike at the end of the war. Let me give you guys a 5-minute break, and I'll continue after that. I'll answer any questions in the meantime if anybody has any.
Where did you post the reading that you sent?
I'll post them in the announcement for you guys.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Okay, let's carry on. The other thing that Ike introduces is, of course, this draconian regulation over his own guards. Um, any guard that allows a prisoner to escape is arrested and handed over to the Gestapo for negligently releasing a prisoner. Uh, any prisoner attempting to escape is shot without warning. Warning shots are prohibited on principle. So by March of 1935, there are now 7 concentration camps in Germany. They'll contain at that time between 7,000 and 9,000 prisoners. And by 1937, the death's heads units will have 4,833 officers and enlisted men and non-coms. Most of them are between the ages of 16 and 20. And so in 1939, once Germany goes to war, these young concentration camp guards, of course, will be mobilized and replaced by more elderly guards. The system is indeed a slave system. You can see that prisoners are in a uniform, these striped, typical of penal institutions everywhere. These striped pajamas, they're often called, these striped jackets with a number sewn to their uniform. Tattooing will take place in the next generation of concentration camps, particularly Auschwitz, where there's massive slave labor camps. I'm not sure whether inmates in the German concentration camps were later tattooed. You would have to check on this. But certainly in the death camps and at Auschwitz, prisoners were just had that number tattooed on them like cattle are branded. So you can see the numbers sewn to his uniform, and then you can see there's a triangle as well. In this case on his pants. And in this case, you can see there's 2 triangles making up the Star of David, and that indicates the color of that first triangle will indicate his offense, and that second triangle would have been a yellow colored triangle that would indicate that he's Jewish. Here's the entire system. Red were for communists. Green were for professional criminals, habitual criminals. In other words, individuals that were getting perhaps lighter sentences in the conventional criminal justice system in Nazi Germany, if you can imagine such a thing. Or the conventional criminal justice system could not get sufficient evidence to convict them, and so they're just thrown a green triangle on their clothing and locked up in a concentration camp. The blue-colored triangle was for illegal immigrants found in Germany. The purple were for Jehovah's Witnesses. Jehovah Witnesses, it's a sect of Christianity. Jehovah Witnesses refuse to swear oaths or serve in the military. They say that there are biblical prescriptions to this, among other things that Jehovah Witnesses don't do, and so Hitler, of course, took that as an affront that they don't swear an oath of allegiance, they don't serve in the military, so they become a category in the concentration camps all by themselves. The pink triangle is for homosexuals, famously. And then you have everybody who's left over, the black triangle. That category was known as asocial elements. These could include anybody from hooligans, vagrants, homeless people, habitually unemployed, prostitutes, people who complained, people who didn't pay their traffic fines, didn't pay their parking tickets, didn't pay their real estate taxes, and so forth. If they can't find a particular law that may apply to them, they're labeled as social elements, and they get the black triangle. The second row with a stripe above, of course, means that they're a repeat offender, that they were released from the concentration camp but reoffended and are rearrested. The ones with a little target on them are the ones who are in the punishment battalion. And then, of course, if you were one of those categories, plus you were Jewish, then you got a yellow triangle sewed underneath your colored triangle. So just being a Jew did not get you passage into a concentration camp, not yet. That is really way off in the future. We're talking about, for German Jews, the deportation of German Jews does not start until around October of 1941. When the Germans are fighting at the gates of Moscow. So there is no systemic arrest and confinement of Jews at this moment in time in the 1930s into the German concentration camps. For a Jew to end up in a concentration camp, they have to commit some other offense. Now, certainly it's easier if you're Jewish to be convicted of one of those offenses, and certainly if you're a Jewish and you end up in a camp with that triangle there, you're going to be on the short end of the stick. I mean, I can't imagine a worse fate than being a gay Jew in a Nazi concentration camp. I mean, talk about double trouble. There are, of course, also here ideological bizarre shit. In particular, this one here, a Jewish Jehovah Witness. Like how does that work? All right, and you will understand how that works in Nazi Germany once we look at how the Nazis define a Jew. You could be born a Catholic. You could be born in a Jehovah Witness family. You could be born a Baptist. You could be born a Protestant, and under German racial laws, you could still be classified as a Jew. So there will be so-called Catholic Jews, Protestant Jews, and when we look at Nazi race laws, we'll see how the Nazis define who's a Jew. And certainly it's not only whether you're practicing Judaism or not. There's all other things that will define who is Jewish and who's not. If you attempted to escape, of course, you get this target on your back. And then you have these two indicators. These are the one on the left for males and the one on the right for females. These are the crime is called Rassenschade, race pollution. It means a non-Jew having sex with a Jew. That's a felony, miscegenation. And so that gets you into a concentration camp as well if you're caught. And usually it's through denunciations. If you're either a male or a female and you're German, then you're caught having sex with someone who's Jewish, you end up in the concentration camp with that attached to it. Then you have little subcategories like AP for those who are of Polish citizenship and end up in the camp, or T for Czechs, and so forth. If you were a member of the armed forces and you ended up in the concentration camp, you get this inverted triangle, and so on. The camps themselves are essentially run by two categories of prisoners, the red and green triangles. I don't know how many of you ever had that wonderful opportunity of serving in prison, but if you ever do end up in a prison, you'll learn that guards don't run the prison. It's the prisoners. Guards have no idea what's going on inside a cell block, and it's the same for the concentration camps. Guards tried not to stroll into the camp itself. They preferred to stay on the wire, outside the wire, or in the guard tower. It was the so-called capos who were chosen to be kind of the trustees. And so the communists, because they were already kind of a clandestine organization, they were already a revolutionary organization with clandestine organizational roots, very quickly organized themselves inside the concentration camp. And so the communists tended to run the administration offices. They were the translators, the photographers in the camp. They were the record keepers. They were often working in the medical block. They were the physicians, the nurses, the cooks, all those individuals that helped the Nazis in the administration of the camp administration, the supply clerks, and so forth. As I said, Nazi SS guards tried to stay out of the concentration camp. They would go in maybe once or twice a day, but they tried to keep out. Partly as well is guards are very scared of getting typhus. Typhus is a common disease passed by lice, and guards are constantly frightened of catching a disease from the inmates. And guards, you do have a high fatality rate among guards, especially medical SS officers. Some of them will die of typhus that they contract inside the camps. So, as I say, the guards prefer that the prisoners run themselves inside the camp. So, as I say, the communists tended to run the administrative functions of the camp. The physical block leaders and barrack leaders were the green triangles, the criminals, where you kind of had to have hands-on discipline over inmates. And so many of the beatings of the inmates and the brutalization of the inmates, and it's unregulated, was actually done by fellow prisoners, often with green triangles that the SS promoted and advanced. So at the end of the war, you had a very high survival rate among communist concentration camp inmates and criminals, or those labeled as criminals in the concentration camp systems. Now, since the criminals were often, as I say, brutal capos inside the barrack, charged with disciplining prisoners, they were often killed at the end of the war by fellow prisoners. Some ended up being prosecuted. I think there's a famous case in Israel where a Jewish couple is prosecuted. And, his defense was, I was an inmate. I wasn't, I don't know how that went for him in the court of law in Israel. But there's a high rate of survival among the communist concentration camp guards, to the point that in Germany, the kind of association of former concentration camp inmates, it was a kind of a very left-wing, almost, it wasn't, I wouldn't describe it as a communist, but a very left-wing organization, because essentially they were members of either the Socialist Party or the Communist Party that had managed, because of their organizational skills, to survive. The Jehovah Witnesses, the asocials, and the illegal immigrants, and the gays did not have as high a survival rate in the camps. But there are people who went in 1934 and survived through 1945. They survived 11 years in these concentration camps, and walked away alive. And that, of course, is not the case for the Reinhard camps, that are the death camps, the kind of second generation camps, or camps like Auschwitz and so forth. Here again, you can see slave laborers, and as that officer passes by, they're quickly snapping to attention and taking their caps off. Failure to do that would get you 25 strokes of the cane on your buttocks. So Nazi Germany is a slave state, much more cruel and lethal, certainly, than African American slavery in the United States. You got to remember that African slaves were bought by their owners. Their owners invested quite a high number of, equivalent to like $5,000 into purchasing a slave, and so, unless the owner was a psycho, and certainly there were psycho owners who abused their slaves. If an African American slave who's bought, injures himself, their owner gets them the best medical service that he can find, because he's got this investment in the slave. That's not the case for Nazi slaves. Nazi slaves are captured for free and are used up. The wartime slave survival rate was 9 months, and if a slave injured themselves or was sick, they would just be killed, and that's the end of the story. So they were just used up. So it's a much more cruel slave system than we imagine. The gates, of course, had these slogans, inscriptions built in: Arbeit macht frei, labor makes you free. it's a kind of a mocking, sardonic joke. Makes you free of what? Labor makes you free of who you are. Labor frees you from being a Jew. Labor frees you from being a communist, and so forth. That's the joke. So the camps, as I say, and Auschwitz will be run by the WVHA, unlike Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec, which are run by the RSHA. It's a business enterprise. It's about business, and here you can see Department E, Economic Enterprises. The SS actually, this is what that looks like. The SS actually set up all these corporations, many of which are still functioning today. At that time, when they're first set up, these corporations were, the boards of directors were all SS operatives. The CEOs were SS officers, and the employees were all slaves. And they had numerous sectors, as you can see. Some of these sectors, building works, these are all the different corporations. Building works, there were brickworks, they produced cement, there were a petroleum refinery, there were luxury goods like ceramics, there were food corporations, and so, for example, here you can see W3, and this again is in Oswald's poll, WVH. You have the Apollinaris Corporation that produces mineral water, and it's slaves that work in the bottling plant producing mineral water. This was a mineral water company, as I say, set up by the SS. In fact, the CEO is Oswald Pohl himself. The operating officer is a SS Hauptsturmführer, that's equivalent to a captain in the military, Friedrich Rabnik. And Apollinaris mineral water, as set up by the SS, is still at work. You can buy Apollinaris water in Loblaws. Here it is, with that creepy red triangle on the label, the Queen of Table Waters. Now it's distributed by the Gourmet Award Foods of Canada. Same company. And of course, we talk about this kind of corporate longevity. Nazis come and go, but corporations and their shareholders stay. The same corporations that were paying out dividends off of slave labor from the past to their shareholders are still paying dividends to their shareholders from all the corporate wealth that had accumulated over these years since the Second World War, from Apollinaris' position in the marketplace, having had this advanced jump into the economy on the basis of being able to use slave labor. So, when I talk about Hitler's billions still circulating in the economy, and those products and companies like Tyson Elevators that operate, that Ryerson University has a contract with to maintain and operate all the elevators in Ryerson. These were the same corporations that essentially committed these atrocities. The corporate treasury is the same. Some of the money has blood on it, some of it doesn't. The corporation is the same corporation, but the board of directors has changed, and new shareholders have come online, but that same corporation lives on. And of course, that's a problem, especially once you get into kind of transnational global world wars, where you know you have global corporations that are servicing both sides of the conflict. So huge corporate arm within the SS. Just to give you some statistics on the camps themselves. We have some numbers for the population of the camps. So, as I said, by March of 1935, there were 7,000 to 9,000 inmates. And then the numbers get cloudy. We know that between August of 1937 and July of 1938, 4 more concentration camps are added to the, 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 the 7 camps that were built by 37. So in other words, by 1938, you have 11 concentration camps. Um, and many of these concentration camps also have satellite camps, small camps. For those of you who saw the movie, Schindler's List, that's kind of fairly accurate as to how these camps were organized. You would have, a brickwork is a separate little sub camp, and so the main concentration camp just feeds replacement slaves into these various sub camps and industries, whether they're mining stone or they're bottling mineral water. They're being kind of fed from a central concentration camp to multiples of subcamps, and there were over 1,000 little subcamps as well. By December of 1942, so we're talking into the war now, there'll be 88,000 prisoners in the German concentration camp system. By August of 1943, there'll be 224,000. And by now, of course, we're including Auschwitz. Although in the first year of Auschwitz, from 1939 till about the beginning of 1942, the majority of inmates at Auschwitz were Poles and Russian prisoners of war. They were not Jews. Jews start arriving at Auschwitz in 1942. Those that are not dispatched to the annihilation camps. But again, that's another lecture in the future. The camps do have a high death rate, and again, mostly of disease. For example, according to medical reports, out of the December 1942, out of the 88,000 inmates registered, 57,000 died of disease in a period of 6 months. So we're talking about a very high death rate, and of course deprivation as well. The hygiene is substandard, the diet is substandard. 5th of April 1944, there are now 20 concentration camps and 165 subsidiary camps. These are secondary camps from which, again, you have these satellite camps branching off. August of 1944, 15th of August, there are now over 500,000 concentration camp inmates. 524,286. 379,000 are males, 145,000 are females. So 50-50 almost male, females. No, not quite, I guess maybe 70-30. This does not include, of course, people that arrive at these camps and are immediately sent to the gas chamber without getting tattooed or registered or even counted. So when the numbers I'm giving you are numbers of registered prisoners on the books, not the number who entered the gates of the camp and find themselves by the end of the day having been shot or gassed and cremated or buried. The last number we have is 15th of January 1945. This is shortly before Auschwitz is liberated by the Red Army. You now have almost 750,000 inmates, 714,000 inmates, 500 males and 200 females. An estimated third of the 700,000 inmates will die in the next 4 months, mostly from deprivation, forced marches, and just being shot by the side of the road, and disease. There's just a breakdown of the German concentration camp system in Germany as Germans are evacuating inmates from the camps in the east and just packing them into these transit camps. For example, Bergen-Belsen is described as a concentration camp, but it never was that. It only became a concentration camp in the last weeks of the war because it was a transit camp. And so Germans can no longer feed themselves, let alone inmates, and so they just let the inmates starve to death or die of disease. So a third of that 714,000, it's estimated, will die. And by then, you have 40,000 SS concentration camp guards altogether. It just tells you how large the guard ranks are. So that's the SSTV, the concentration camp system. Then you have, of course, the Waffen-SS, the biggest armed. Himmler right away, once the SA are exterminated, or at least declawed and detoothed, Himmler right away starts lobbying Hitler to start arming sections of the SS, militarizing them. And the military, of course, resists this. And so the SS, for a long time, have difficulty getting weapons consigned to them. The Waffen-SS are first tested in Poland, and then they're tested again in France and Belgium and the Netherlands in May of 1940, when the Blitzkrieg restarts again. And there, the Waffen-SS distinguished themselves. And once Himmler makes a deal with the army that although a Waffen-SS division and its regiments will be commanded by Waffen-SS officers, the actual deployment of the division on the field, its strategic deployment, will be under the command of a regular army general who is commanding a particular corps of divisions. And so once that deal is made, the army will welcome the Waffen-SS once the invasion of the Soviet Union begins on June 22nd, 1941, Operation Barbarossa. So it takes Himmler some time, and as I say, eventually the Waffen-SS will have at least 800,000 men. They wear a military gray uniform as opposed to the black uniform. The black uniform, as I said in previous lecture, once the war starts, is kind of seen as a ceremonial uniform for guys that didn't go to war. Here's Seb Dietrich, an SS general, so you can get a sense of, again, the coloring of the uniform. This is the commander of the Leibstandarte, what used to be Hitler's bodyguards, who become his ceremonial, like the Coldstream Guards. They become the ceremonial guards of Hitler, the life guards. Very short guy. He's almost like a dwarf. And of course, the Leibstandarte, once the war in Russia begins, is deployed as first as an infantry division, and then later as a panzer armored division. So it's the first division. Here's Seb Dietrich in a Russian village. Perpetrating essentially ethnic cleansing. The Waffen-SS, of course, will be notorious for battlefield excesses. The regular German army more or less maintains a certain amount of discipline and compliance with the Hague Convention, with the practices, usages, and laws of warfare as best they can. The Waffen-SS, as a party organization, sees the war as a completely different thing. They don't see it as necessarily a political war or territorial war. They see it as a race war. And so on the battlefield, often the Waffen-SS are gratuitously committing atrocities against POWs and against the civilian population. Here you can see they're approaching a farm in a kind of a free fire zone. They round up all the males of military age, and they just shoot them dead by the side of the cornfield or the wheat field. Americans, of course, come up against the Waffen-SS during the Battle of the Bulge. They get their first taste of what it means to be captured by the Waffen-SS. The SS line up these American POWs and just machine gun them. It's known as the Malmedy Massacre. Here he is, in fact, the perpetrator, one of the youngest SS officers, Johann Peppier. In fact, 13 kilometers outside of Malmedy, where his troops will perpetrate that massacre. He's one of the youngest winners of the Knight's Cross, and you'll notice as well, on top of that, not only the Knight's Cross is the next Iron Cross after the Iron Cross First Class. It's worn around the neck, and when you win a second Iron Knight's Cross, then you get this oak leaf cluster around it. And then if you get a third one, you get cross swords attached to the oak leaf cluster. And if you get a fourth one, you get diamonds, a cluster of diamonds around them. So nice crosses are kind of for the highest acts of bravery on the battlefield. It's a fairly high award, and Peppier he's like under 30 when he gets that. He also gets a nickname, Blowtorch, because he likes setting fire to Russian villages. So, in fact, all his company is known as Pepier's blowtorches. They just set fire to everything along the way. And Pepier, of course, is arrested at the end of the war. He ends up being tried by the Americans for war crimes, and he's sentenced to death for the execution of American POWs. But then an American senator comes to their rescue. That senator believes that Pepier and his killers will be the best fighters against the threat of communism coming. And so he ensures that not only are they all eventually their death sentences are commuted, but very quickly they're all released. They're pardoned. So all these killers get released, and of course that senator. His name was Joseph McCarthy. He, of course, becomes the chairman of HUAC, the House on Un-American Activities hearings. We have the word McCarthyism, of course, that's given to us by Joe McCarthy. But long before he got on, into HUAC, McCarthy was freeing Nazis. Pepier ends up settling in, retiring to a French village. He gets a cottage on the outskirts of this village. And I'm in high school. It's like 1970 or 1971 when I read in the newspapers that these French villagers find out who it is with the strange accent who's living in their village. And so the entire village shows up at Pepier's house with pitchforks and torches, something like out of a Frankenstein movie. And they set fire to Pepier's house, burning blowtorch inside his little cottage, his little retirement heaven. So I guess a lot of Nazis escaped justice. Pepier certainly wasn't one of them, at least for formal justice. By October of 1941, the Germans have suffered catastrophic battlefield deaths in Russia, and they're winning the war. And so the Nazis are running out of German men, military-aged men already by 1942. They're getting scarce. And so the Nazis now start recruiting through SS Foreign Legions volunteers from everywhere in occupied Europe and parallel countries as well. They essentially sell the mission as fighting for a new order. In fact, the way the Nazis will describe themselves in Europe, they'll describe themselves as the new order. That's the formal name. They will describe themselves as fighting against communism, liberating Western civilization from the communist threat. And in their posters, they'll often make some kind of reference to every ethnicity, to kind of a historical model. So here you can see the Dutch are being encouraged to join the fight against Bolshevism. There's a figure there from the old Dutch Republic that the Nazis have appropriated, and as they encourage, Dutch are kind of Nordic. They're blonde, blue-eyed, so they're encouraged to join the SS. Here you have the Norwegians. Kemp for Norge, fight for Norway, be a Viking. And in fact, the Norwegian Waffen-SS division, it's a Scandinavian Waffen-SS division, is going to be called the Viking division, the 5th Waffen-SS division. That's the one that Mengele serves as a medical officer in, and he's wounded in Russia. Here's the Hungarian SS division. Here's the Croatian, Bosnian, Herzegovinian SS division. And you can see again, they're fighting, against communism. And of course, what happens is the way they're going to end up fighting against communism, of course, is once they get into uniform, they're sent off to kill local Jews, Serbs, and so forth. They suddenly realize the fight against communism means kill all the Jews, because of that whole notion of the Nazi notion of the Judeo-Bolshevik threat. There is no difference between a communist and a Jew. Oh, you thought you were going to fight communists in Russia? No, you're going to fight communists here at home first. You're going to kill all the women and children, Jewish women and children from the next village. That's how you're going to fight communism. So here you can see again the Islamic troops. And they have on their collars, of course, they have a swastika, and you can see they have a kind of jihadi sword along with the swastika. And Hitler, of course, will co-opt the Mufti of Jerusalem, who come to Nazi Germany, be greeted by the Nazis, and he will, bless the Islamic troops going into service. Ukrainians, of course, who have been fighting for autonomy against the Soviets on the assumption that the Germans have come as liberators from the Soviet Union, rush into all these Ukrainian Cossack units, as there are also Russians who join as well, thinking that the Germans are much better choice of the two evils than Stalin and the communists, and of course they have no idea of what German plans were for the Ukrainians and the Russians and the Belarusians and all the other Slavic people. Essentially, Hitler was going to enslave those that could work and kill off everybody else. These guys, I don't even have any idea who they are. I know they're not Germans. They look like maybe Siberian Inuit that maybe were captured on the Russian front and then co-opted into the German army. You have the Hindi Tigers. These are all Indians who volunteered for the German army because they were, of course, Indian nationalists, and they felt that fighting the British, they're fighting the British colonial rule in India, and of course, German kooky racial theory. Remember that whole theory about how the Aryans came from the mountains and Himalayas, kind of recognized the Indians, despite the fact that they have brown skin, brown eyes, predominantly are dark. They're recognized as Aryans. So the blue-eyed blonde is kind of clouding the waters. There were so many Germans that were anything but blue-eyed and blonde that it's not really about being blonde and blue-eyed. It's a much more sophisticated racial hierarchies that the Nazis adopt. The Indian troops are going to be the last to actually fight in Germany defending Berlin. In fact, when the Russians take a bunker in Berlin and they suddenly find all these Indian troops inside, dead Indian troops inside the bunker, they're looking at their maps like, what the hell? Did we take a wrong turn somewhere? Is this Berlin or is this Bombay? Like, what the hell is this? There are all these guys in turbans. Right? Here you are, the Hindi Tigers. Some of them were deployed in Rommel's army on the Western Front when Rommel was in command of the Atlantic Wall. You also had British and Canadian volunteers in the Waffen-SS, the St. George's Brigade. 3 Canadians from Calgary managed to end up joining this St. George's unit. They're headed by John Amory, who was Amory is the son of a very distinguished British diplomat, Amory. John Amory became a fascist leader in Britain, and once the war starts, he goes over to Europe and he begins recruiting British POWs captured in France at Dunkirk and so forth. You can see they wear the Union Jack on their sleeve, but otherwise they're wearing an SS uniform. And they have the kind of Royal British Lions as their divisional symbol. Here's their propaganda poster. Your place is here with us. They didn't see, there weren't that many of them. I would say maybe 100. Their history is mostly lost. I'm very curious about the St. George's Brigade, but there's very little known about them. Apparently, like I said, they're recruited out of British POW camps. There were disciplinary problems with them. They kind of they were kind of a little bit like soccer hooligans, heavy drinkers, and there's no known combat deployment of the British St. George's Waffen-SS Brigade. And certainly they weren't brigade strength. They were just called a brigade. But there is a lot of propaganda in the POW camps trying to recruit these soldiers. And here's some of John Amory's kind of propaganda. Why die for Stalin? Why die for the Jews? That's how he sold the movement. Amory will be captured at the end of the war in Italy, where the St. George's Brigade ends up in northern Italy, and he will be hung by the British as a traitor. So that's the Waffen-SS. As I say, of those 800,000 men, several hundred thousand weren't German. Several hundred thousand belonged. There was a Spanish volunteers, Portuguese volunteers, who were neutral countries. There was a French division of SS called the Charlemagne Division. There were several Russian divisions, several Ukrainian divisions, Hungarians, Norwegians, Danes, almost every European country found among them sympathizers with the Nazi cause who joined them. So that's roughly the 800,000 Waffen-SS. As I say, by 1941, a lot of the German Waffen-SS men have already been killed, and so they're running out of Germans. Although obviously lots of Germans will still remain. The Allgemeine SS is now what's left over. You could call them kind of maybe the SS Reserve. Allgemeine means general SS. This includes honorary SS members. You see all these portraits I show you of senior Nazi officials, and they're all wearing an SS uniform with a general's rank, a Gruppenführer general's rank, and they're all wearing the same rank. Here's Ribbentrop, who's the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Bormann. These are honorary ranks. So even though while wearing his honorary assessment uniform, Bormann on paper has to report up to Himmler. Himmler is his commander. Bormann really is in charge and tells Himmler what to do. Nor does the Minister of Foreign Affairs, like Ribbentrop, take his orders from Himmler. So it's strictly ceremonial. They get to wear that cool black uniform. That's what it was about in the 1930s. They get to be part of the Teutonic Knights, but they're not part of the command system. These are honorary Allgemeine SS-men. And as well, you have kind of the weekend warriors, the SS militia, the reserves, like this idiot with his idiot son, father SS-man, son, the Hitler Youth boy. These are also not front-ranking assessment, and often these are the guys who people were beginning to laugh at during the war, because they're the ones who retained that black ceremonial uniform. They wouldn't even be issued combat fatigues or a gray uniform, because this guy isn't going to war. This guy's going to stay at home in his other job, and he'll just be an assessment on the weekend, right? Weekend warriors.